John Miller was never the kind of man who drew attention. Tall, with shoulders that were always slightly stooped and hands calloused from working the land, he was as much a part of the Cedar Valley landscape as the golden fields of wheat that stretched as far as the eye could see. From an early age, his dream was clear: to be a military pilot, to put on the uniform and feel the power of a jet roaring beneath his feet as it cut through the sky at high speed. This dream was born from the influence of his father, a retired aviation mechanic who would feed his son's afternoons with stories about fighter jets, training, and the deafening sound of turbines. But reality has its own plans, and for John, it came early. His father's premature death forced him to abandon his dream and take over the family farm. At 19, he traded the sound of turbines for the roar of the tractor and military flight lessons for harvest schedules and weekly spraying. Time passed quickly. Before John knew it, he was in his 40s, with 2 loyal dogs and a routine that seemed unchanging. He operated small agricultural planes, flying low over fields and spraying crops as part of the work that supported his community. It wasn't glamorous, but there was a certain dignity to it. He knew every curve of the terrain, every treacherous wind current, every risk involved. Flying was still a part of his life, but in a very different way than he had imagined it as a child. Still, every time he heard a fighter jet streaking overhead, he would stop what he was doing, take off his cap, and look up. It was instinctive. It stirred something inside him, a memory, a wound perhaps. It wasn't bitterness. It was a longing for what could have been. The morning that began seemed like any other. John woke up before the sun, as he always did, and went outside to check the levels in the spray tank. The sky was clear, that pale blue that only appears in the first minutes of the day. As he walked to the makeshift hangar behind the barn, he saw an unfamiliar pickup truck parked at the farm's entrance. It was unusual to have visitors at that time of day, much less from outsiders. A gray-haired woman with a firm posture and a determined look in her eyes got out of the vehicle. Her name was Margaret. She was holding a wooden box with trembling fingers, but her gaze held a strength that caught John's attention immediately. She said she was looking for him, specifically. She was the mother of an Air Force pilot who had died in the line of duty 2 years earlier, and her son used to fly over that area during training. There was something about the way she spoke that made everything seem urgent, important, almost solemn. John invited her in, still confused, and they sat on the porch. Margaret placed the box on the table and explained that she had spent months trying to find someone specific. Inside the box were her son's personal belongings: a journal, flight maps, aerial photographs, and among them an unfinished letter. In it, the pilot described his flights over Cedar Valley with an enthusiasm that mixed technique and emotion. He mentioned golden fields, turns that defied physics, and curiously, a small crop duster that he always saw from afar, flying low, performing maneuvers almost as daring as his own. The letter spoke of admiration. Margaret wanted John to know that, even without realizing it, he had been a role model for her son. That hit John hard. For the first time in a long time, someone had looked at him and seen more than a farmer, more than a crop duster operator. It was as if somehow he had become part of that world from which he had always felt excluded. John didn't know how to react. It had a strange effect on him, as if a past he had already buried was knocking on his door, begging for attention. He held the diary in his hands and flipped through a few pages. It was written in a firm, young handwriting, full of technical details that only someone with a true passion for flying would be able to write. The notes spoke of altitude, maneuvers, but also of sensations, like the coldness in his hands during turns and the relief when feeling the plane stabilize. What impressed John the most was the way the young man described his presence. "Every time I pass by here, I see that same agricultural plane. His precision in turns is absurd. I think if I weren't in the Air Force, I would want to fly like him." That kept hammering away at John's mind for days. It was as if, even without meaning to, he had left a mark on the military world that he had always admired, and now, somehow, it was coming back to him. Margaret didn't stay long. She didn't want to get in the way, she said. She just wanted to deliver the material and, in a way, fulfill a mission that her own son hadn't had time to finish. Before she left, she looked at John with teary eyes and said she hoped he knew how much this meant. After the truck disappeared down the dirt road, John stood for a few minutes on the porch with the box beside him, feeling the weight of it all. He went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared into space. The sound of a military plane crossing the sky at that exact moment seemed like an absurd coincidence, as if the universe were giving him a signal. For the first time in years, he cried. It wasn't a loud cry, but a quiet outburst, as if something inside him had finally let go. The next morning, John woke up different. It wasn't a visible change, but there was something new in the way he walked to the hangar, something more attentive, almost careful. He took the box with the pilot's belongings to the shed where he kept his agricultural aircraft and spent more time than usual checking the aircraft. For some reason, he felt that this flight would not be just another routine job. He climbed aboard, turned on the systems, listened to the engine roar, and for a few seconds, he closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he saw everything differently. When he took off, he flew lower than usual, as he did on the riskiest stretches, and made a precise, almost artistic turn, as if he were being watched. It wasn't vanity, it was respect. In a way, he was paying homage to that young pilot who admired him without ever having exchanged a word with him. And perhaps, without realizing it, he was rediscovering a part of himself that he thought he had left behind. During that flight, John decided to follow the same route that the pilot usually took. He knew which route it was because the diary contained detailed notes with coordinates and visual landmarks of the region. He flew over the same wheat field described in the letters, past the river that reflected the morning sun like liquid glass, and flew over the old train station, now deactivated. At each point, he tried to see what the young man saw, and, to his surprise, he found beauty where before he had only seen work. The view that had always been there, the tones of the fields, the lines formed by the furrows of the crops, the contrast between the earth and the sky, now seemed different. For the first time, he was not flying just to fulfill a function. He was flying to feel, to connect with something bigger. And the more he flew, the more he realized that this moment was not just about the past, but about finding meaning in the present. When he landed, John didn't turn off the engine right away. He stood for a few seconds with his hands on the controls, watching the field in front of him. It was the same place as always, but at that moment, it seemed more meaningful. When he finally turned everything off and got out of the cabin, he felt a different kind of tiredness, not physical, but emotional, as if he had relived something that had been kept hidden for decades. He walked silently to the wooden bench next to the hangar and sat there with Margaret's box on his lap. He picked up the pilot's unfinished letter again and read the last paragraph in a low voice, the one that ended without a full stop. It was as if the letter asked to be finished, as if it was waiting for an answer, and in that silence, interrupted only by the singing of a few birds, John knew what he had to do. He didn't want to let it die like just another beautiful memory. For the first time, he felt he had something to say, something to give back to the world of military aviation, even if in a simple way. That afternoon, John wrote a letter. It wasn't something he usually did, but he felt he had to. He wrote to the airbase where the pilot had flown on his missions. He told them who he was, what he did, and how he had discovered, through Margaret, that he was part of the story of someone he had never met. He told them about the flight he had taken that day, how he had followed the route described in the diary, and how it had rekindled something inside him. It was a heartfelt, no-nonsense letter. Just someone from the countryside telling them how a simple gesture, the recognition of a young pilot and the kindness of a mother, had touched his life in a profound way. At the end of the letter, he wrote a sentence he had never said out loud. I may never have worn the uniform, but today, somehow, I felt part of it all. He folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and the next day drove into town to drop it off at the post office. And with that, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a visible change, but it was real. A few weeks had passed since the letter had been sent, and the routine on the farm had returned to normal. But John, on the inside, was no longer the same. He began to notice things he had ignored before. The sound of the wind in the leaves, the reflection of the sun on the plane's bodywork, the smell of oil when it was being serviced. Little details that now seemed loaded with meaning. He also began to record his flights, not with pretty words, but with honest notes, the way the young pilot had done. He bought a simple notebook and kept it in his jacket pocket. It was as if he was finally giving voice to a part of himself that had been silent for years. And it didn't change the job, it didn't make it lighter or easier, but it did make him feel like he belonged there in a new way. He was no longer just the guy in the crop duster. He was someone who had inspired a hero, and somehow that made all the difference. The response from the airbase arrived on a Monday morning in a letter-headed envelope. It was a short letter signed by a colonel. It thanked him for sharing his story and informed him that John's account had been read during an internal ceremony honoring fallen pilots. They said that the pilot's mother, Margaret, had also been present that day and had made a point of reading his letter aloud. John read it silently, his eyes welling up. This wasn't fame or a medal, but it was something real, a recognition that cut across any uniform, any rank. He carefully placed the letter in the wooden box Margaret had left and placed it in a private space in the house, away from the noise of the farm, as if he were protecting a precious piece of his own history. He had never thought he would be part of something bigger, and now he knew that somehow he had. At the end of that month, John did something he had never done before. He completely stopped his farm routine for an entire day. He woke up early, as usual, but he didn't go straight to the barn or check the equipment. Instead, he got in the plane and took off without carrying pesticides or following a work route. He flew for the sake of flying. He flew for himself, for his father, for the pilot he had never met, and for Margaret. On that flight, he climbed higher than he usually did, without worrying about fuel consumption or time on duty. It was a clean, almost silent flight, in which the sound of the engine seemed to merge with his thoughts. From up high, he could see the city in the distance, the fields he had helped farm for decades, and the makeshift runway that now took on new meaning. It was as if, in that moment, he were being watched, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was a look of presence, of recognition, as if the Air Force boy were there, following every move. When he landed, there was no applause or tributes, just the silence of the farm and the creak of the propeller slowing down. But inside John, there was a feeling he had never experienced so clearly: belonging. Not to the army, nor to military aviation, but to something greater, to the silent legacy of ordinary people who, even without uniforms or insignia, leave deep marks on the lives of others. He thought of his father, who perhaps never knew how important he was in awakening that dream. He thought of Margaret, whose pain became a bridge between two worlds. And he thought of that pilot, who saw greatness in the simplicity of his routine flights. John finally understood that life does not always make our dreams come true the way we imagine. Sometimes it gives us back those dreams in other forms, discreet, unexpected, but equally powerful. Over time, the box Margaret brought became part of the house. Not as a trophy, but as a constant reminder. Some days, John would open it, read excerpts from the diary, review the maps, and try to imagine the young pilot's flights as if he were right there with him. It stopped being a burden and became almost like company. Little by little, neighbors and friends who knew the story began to see John in a different light, but he never changed his ways. He remained the same quiet, dedicated man who cared for the land and flew his planes with almost instinctive precision. The difference was that now he knew he had made a difference in someone's life. He knew that his work, even if invisible to many, had been noticed by those who really mattered. And that changed everything inside. There was no longer that feeling of a dream interrupted. There was a calm acceptance, a quiet peace that he had never felt before. Sometimes, sitting on the porch at the end of the day, he would still look up at the sky when he heard the distant sound of jets cutting through the clouds. But now, his gaze was different. It was no longer one of longing or frustration. It was one of connection. It was as if he were at peace with that boy who dreamed of being a military pilot, and with the man who, despite their different paths, never stopped flying. Margaret's visit didn't change John's life with big events or dramatic turns. It changed it with meaning, with presence, with truth. Deep down, he knew that he would never be remembered in history books, nor would his name be engraved on some wall of heroes. But for someone, he was exactly that, and that was enough. Because sometimes, true overcoming doesn't come from changing everything around us, but from finally understanding the value of what we already were all along.